For 100 years, the aliens surrounded our sun. Not raiders, not pirates. These were ancient beings so advanced they had wrapped entire stars in metal shells, harvesting solar energy like humans harvest wheat. They had dismantled solar systems the way a child dismantles a toy. And they chose humanity as their next project. They blockaded Sol. They cut every supply line. They starved billions. They didn't even bother attacking. They just waited. Waited for humanity to quietly stop existing. But deep in the debris field surrounding our dying sun, buried among the shattered wreckage of their own broken Dyson megastructures, a small team of human engineers found something the aliens never expected anyone to find: a way to fight back, using the enemy's own celestial bones. If this story already has your blood pumping, smash that like button, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales right now, and drop a comment. What would you build from alien wreckage? Now buckle up, because we're diving straight into the Siege of Sol, and humanity is done being the victim. The year was 2387, and the Sol system had become a cage. 103 years. That was how long the blockade had been in place. 103 years since the alien fleet, if you could even call it a fleet, because it looked more like a moving civilization, materialized at the edge of the heliosphere and began its slow, suffocating tightening around humanity's home system. Nobody had seen them coming. That was the first lesson humanity learned about its new captors. They did not announce themselves. They did not broadcast demands. They simply arrived, the way a geological catastrophe arrives. Not with malice exactly, but with an absolute and total indifference to whatever stood in their way. Their ships were not ships in any human sense of the word. They were structures. Some were the size of small moons. Others stretched across hundreds of kilometers, their surfaces covered in hexagonal solar collection panels, so dense and so perfectly arranged that they absorbed starlight the way a black hole absorbs matter, completely, greedily, without giving a single photon back. The aliens had been doing this for millennia, moving from star to star, wrapping suns in engineered megastructures, harvesting energy on a scale that made human nuclear reactors look like birthday candles. And whenever a civilization was unfortunate enough to be living around one of those target stars, the aliens simply blockaded them. No invasion, no ground war, no dramatic orbital bombardment. Just a slow, patient siege, because the aliens had learned something long ago that humanity was still processing. You don't need to destroy a species, you just need to outlast them. Commander Dale Harmon understood this better than anyone alive. He was 57 years old, built like a man who had been forged rather than born, with gray at his temples and permanent dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep ever seemed to fix. He had been assigned to Outpost Hephaestus, a battered deep space research and salvage station anchored in the asteroid belt, 11 years ago, when Earth's Central Command had quietly stopped believing in grand military solutions and started desperately funding anything that looked even remotely like a long shot. Harmon was their long shot. He stood at the observation deck of Hephaestus and stared out at what his crew had taken to calling the graveyard. It stretched in every direction as far as the sensors could reach. Billions of fragments, trillions of tons of alien material, hexagonal panels the size of city blocks, structural lattices that curved like the ribs of impossibly massive creatures, thermal conduit pipes so wide that a transport freighter could fly through them without touching the walls. All of it dead, all of it dark, shattered remnants of the alien Dyson construction that had been partially assembled around Sol before some ancient internal conflict, or perhaps a simple engineering failure from centuries ago, had torn sections of it apart. The aliens hadn't bothered to clean it up. Why would they? They had the patience of geological time. They would get back to it. They always did. But in the meantime, they had accidentally left humanity the single most valuable junkyard in the known galaxy. LiDAR sweep just came back, said Chief Engineer Marcus Webb, stepping up beside Harmon with a data tablet in one hand and a cold cup of coffee in the other. Webb was 39, wiry, perpetually underdressed for the station's temperature, and possibly the most gifted materials engineer humanity had ever produced. He had also not slept in approximately 40 hours, which was becoming his default setting. We found another cluster, Sector 14, Looks like thermal collector arrays, mostly intact. 40, maybe 50 panels. Harmon didn't take his eyes off the graveyard. Mass? Roughly 600,000 tons per panel. The number landed in the room like a dropped anchor. Harmon finally turned and looked at Webb. And the alloy composition? Webb set down his coffee, tapped through the tablet, and handed it over. Same hyperdense alien composite we've been cataloging for 3 years. The stuff that makes our best titanium look like aluminum foil. He paused. Sir, if the structural models I've been running are even close to accurate, and I believe they are, a hull built from this material could withstand a direct hit from our most powerful kinetic weapons without so much as a dent. Harmon stared at the readout for a long moment. Around them, the station hummed with the low vibration of recycled air processors and the quiet chatter of skeleton crew technicians running overnight analysis shifts. Outside, through 3 inches of reinforced composite viewport, the graveyard glittered like broken stars. How much do we need? Harmon asked quietly. Webb took a slow breath. For what I'm proposing? All of it. Harmon handed the tablet back. He walked to the viewport and pressed one hand against the cold surface, looking out at the debris field that humanity's ancestors had been picking through for decades, scavenging small pieces for research, for shielding upgrades, for academic study, never once thinking big enough to ask the real question. Not, what can we learn from this wreckage, but what can we build? Pull up the construction proposal, Harmon said. Sir, Central Command hasn't approved. I didn't ask about Central Command. Harmon's voice was flat and absolute. Pull it up. Webb pulled it up. The holographic projection materialized above the central console, a wireframe outline of something so massive it took several seconds for the brain to fully process its scale. Not a ship in the traditional sense. A Titan, forged from the alien enemy's own discarded megastructure panels, its hull a patchwork of repurposed sun harvesters, its spine built from salvaged structural lattice, originally designed to hold a Dyson shell together against the gravitational forces of a star. They have been calling it the Indomitable. Central Command thought it was a theoretical exercise. Harmon had other ideas. We have 14 months before the aliens complete the next phase of their tightening maneuver, he said quietly, studying the wireframe. After that, the debris field gets pulled into their construction perimeter, and we lose access permanently. He turned to Webb. Can you build it in 14 months? Webb stared at the projection for a long time. Then he picked up his cold coffee, took a long sip, and said, I'm going to need more engineers. That was the moment the Indomitable stopped being a theory. The moment humanity stopped waiting to die and started building something that would make the aliens regret their patience. But neither Harmon nor Webb knew yet what the aliens had hidden inside those thermal collector arrays, what ancient catastrophic power source had been left dormant in the graveyard for centuries, and what would happen when a species with absolutely nothing left to lose decided to wake it up. The first problem was the alloy. The alien construction material. Webb had started calling it stellar composite in his reports, partly for clarity, and partly because the official catalog designation was 43 characters long, did not want to be touched by human hands. Not metaphorically, literally. The alloy had been engineered by a civilization that operated at temperatures and energy densities that made human industrial processes look primitive. Its molecular structure was so tightly packed, so precisely ordered at the atomic level, that conventional human welding equipment simply bounced off it. Heat didn't penetrate. Cutting tools dulled in seconds. Plasma torches, the most powerful portable cutting devices humanity had ever built, managed to score the surface of a single panel after 6 continuous hours of operation, leaving a groove approximately 2 millimeters deep. The panels were 4 meters thick. Webb stood in the salvage bay of Hephaestus, staring at that 2-millimeter groove, and said nothing for a very long time. Behind him, a team of 12 engineers waited in silence. These were not ordinary engineers. Harmon had spent 3 months quietly pulling the best materials mines from every surviving human installation in the Sol system. From the Martian fabrication yards, from the Lunar Research Collective, from the scattered orbital habitats that clung to existence like barnacles on a sinking ship. These were people who had spent their careers studying alien technology in fragments, in samples, in tiny recovered pieces. None of them had ever tried to actually build with it. The problem, Webb finally said, turning to face the team, is that we're thinking about this wrong. We're trying to manipulate the material using heat and force. That's how we build things. He walked to the panel, placed his palm flat against its surface. It was warm. Not from the plasma torch. It was always warm, as if somewhere deep in its molecular structure, it still remembered the star it had once harvested. But they didn't build with heat and force. They built with frequency. A young engineer, named Connor Hayes, looked up from his diagnostic tablet. Resonant frequency manipulation? The alien construction process almost certainly used targeted acoustic or electromagnetic resonance to realign the molecular bonds of the material during assembly, Webb said. That's the only explanation for how they achieved this level of structural density without any visible seam lines. They didn't weld it. They vibrated it into shape. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Hayes said, "So we need to find the resonant frequency of an alien alloy that no human being has ever successfully analyzed at the molecular level. Reverse engineer a construction process used by a civilization thousands of years more advanced than us, and build a warship hull from scratch using a technique we've never tested in 14 months. 13 months and 3 weeks now," Webb said. "Right. Get started." What followed was the most brutal, sleepless, and quietly heroic engineering effort in human history, and almost no one outside Outpost Hephaestus knew it was happening. Harmon kept it that way deliberately. Central Command was not told the full scope of the project. The official reports filed from Hephaestus described ongoing salvage cataloging operations and material stress analysis programs. Both were technically true. They just omitted the part about the dreadnought. The reason for the secrecy was simple. Harmon had watched enough wartime politics to know exactly what would happen if Central Command learned what he was actually building. There would be committees. There would be review boards. There would be 17 layers of authorization requests and strategic assessment panels, all populated by people who had spent the last century managing humanity's slow retreat and had unconsciously built their entire professional identity around the idea that survival, not victory, was the realistic goal. They would kill the project, not out of malice, out of the particular kind of institutional cowardice that dresses itself up as wisdom. He lied in his reports, called in every favor he had accumulated over 30 years of service, and quietly funneled every available resource on the station toward Webb's team. Meanwhile, in the graveyard, the real work began. Small salvage crews went out daily in modified utility craft, their transponder signatures masked to look like routine debris clearing operations. They navigated deep into the debris field, far deeper than any previous salvage mission had gone, threading between the enormous dead fragments of alien megastructure with a care that bordered on reverence. Not because the aliens deserved reverence, but because one wrong move, one miscalculated approach vector, one moment of inattention near a fragment the size of a skyscraper, and a crew of 6 people would simply cease to exist. 3 weeks into operations, Webb cracked the resonance problem. The breakthrough came at 0340 station time in the middle of a sleep cycle because that was when breakthroughs came, not in triumphant daylight moments, but in the exhausted, half-delirious hours when the rational mind finally loosened its grip enough to let the intuitive mind work. Webb had been studying spectral analysis data from the alien panels for 16 continuous hours when he noticed something in the thermal emission pattern that didn't match any known material behavior. A micro-oscillation, barely detectable, repeating at a frequency of approximately 7.83 terahertz. He stared at it. Then he grabbed Hayes by the shoulder, shook him awake from where he'd fallen asleep at his console, and pointed at the readout. Hayes blinked at it for a long moment. Hayes straightened slowly. That's the frequency at which the material wants to flex. Not flex, Webb said. Receive. The material was designed to receive energy input at that frequency. That's how they bonded panels during construction. They hit it with a 7.83 terahertz pulse, and the molecular lattice temporarily opens up, becomes receptive to geometric realignment. Hayes turned to look at him fully. Can we generate that frequency? We can now, Webb said. 2 days later, in the salvage bay, a modified resonance emitter hit a 4-meter alien panel with a precisely calibrated 7.83 terahertz pulse, and for the first time in human history, a putting tool slid through stellar composite like a blade through warm metal. The room erupted. Not with cheering exactly. These were engineers. They erupted the way engineers erupt, with rapid-fire technical conversation, with furious note-taking, with the particular feverish energy of people who have just confirmed that the impossible is merely very difficult. Harmon was called to the salvage bay at 0600. He walked in, looked at the cleanly cut panel section sitting on the work table, and said nothing for a moment. Then, how long until we can start hull assembly? 6 weeks to tool up properly, Webb said. Then we build. Harmon nodded once. Outside, in the cold and silent graveyard, the skeleton of the Indomitable waited to be born. Built from the alien enemy's own bones, shaped by human hands, powered by the desperate mathematics of a species that had absolutely nothing left to lose. But deep in Sector 14, in the cluster of thermal collector arrays Webb's team had flagged 3 weeks earlier, something ancient and dormant was beginning, very slowly, very quietly, to stir. Hull assembly began on a Tuesday. Nobody marked the date in any official record. There was no ceremony, no speech, no moment of formal acknowledgement. Harmon simply stood at the edge of the primary construction platform, a repurposed alien structural lattice fragment that Webb's team had anchored at the center of the debris field, using the graveyard itself as both raw material and construction scaffolding, and watched the first hull panel get locked into place. The resonance bonders hummed at 7.83 terahertz. The stellar composite panels clicked together with a solidity that no human-built material could match. And in the cold silence of space, the Indomitable began to take shape. It was ugly at first, unavoidably so. The hull sections came from different parts of the graveyard, different alien structures, different construction eras, slightly different panel geometries, and the early assembly looked less like a warship and more like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle being solved by people who had never seen the picture on the box. But Webb had planned for this. His structural integrity models didn't require aesthetic uniformity. They required load distribution, stress point compensation, and what he called salvaged coherence. The principle that a hull made from alien megastructure panels, even mismatched ones, would have an inherent structural resilience that no purpose-built human warship could replicate. Because these panels had been designed to survive the gravitational and thermal forces generated by a star, not to deflect laser fire, not to absorb kinetic impacts, to survive a star. A warship hull built from this material wasn't just strong, it was categorically different from anything that had ever flown in the Sol system. By week 4, the spine was complete. 3 kilometers of salvaged alien structural lattice, fused together with resonance bonds so tight that Webb's stress tests couldn't find a single microfracture. The Indomitable's backbone glittered in the faint light of the blockaded sun, a patchwork of alien geometries that somehow, impossibly looked inevitable, like it had always been there. Like the graveyard had been waiting to give it birth. Harmon walked the spine in a pressure suit, alone, every morning. He didn't do it for inspection purposes. His engineers handled inspections. He did it because he had spent 30 years as a military commander, and he understood something about the psychology of large endeavors. The people building a thing needed to know that someone was watching. Not monitoring. Watching. There was a difference. Monitoring was institutional. Watching was personal. Watching said, I am here, I see what you're doing, and I believe it matters. The crew of Hephaestus, 214 engineers, technicians, pilots, and support staff, worked in rotating 20-hour shifts with 4-hour rest cycles. They ate at their stations, they ran system diagnostics in their sleep. 3 of them requested transfers in the first month, and then withdrew the requests within 48 hours, apparently unable to bring themselves to leave. The work had that effect on people. It was the most important thing any human being was doing anywhere in the solar system, and everyone involved knew it. On day 41, Connor Hayes made the discovery that changed everything. He had been assigned to lead the structural analysis team working in Sector 14, the thermal collector cluster Webb had flagged early on. The collectors themselves had already been cataloged for weapons conversion, which was the other half of Webb's design. The Indomitable's primary armament would not be human-manufactured weapons. It would be the alien thermal collection arrays themselves, reverse-engineered and repurposed to function as kinetic energy batteries of almost inconceivable power. The basic physics were straightforward, at least in theory. The alien thermal collectors had been designed to absorb solar energy at extraordinary efficiency and store it in dense energy matrices for later use. Webb's weapons team had determined that if the storage matrices could be discharged rapidly in a controlled, directional burst, the resulting kinetic release would be equivalent to a continent-sized mass driver. Not metaphorically. The numbers kept coming out the same, no matter how many times the team ran them. A single discharge of a fully charged alien thermal collector matrix would release enough energy to shatter a moon. Central Command would have called it impossible. Webb called it Tuesday. But Hayes wasn't looking at the thermal collectors when he made his discovery. He was running a deep scan analysis of a larger structure behind the collector cluster. A fragment so massive it had registered on early surveys as simply large debris, low priority, when his instruments returned a reading that made him stop breathing for approximately 4 seconds. The structure was not debris. It was a power core. Not a dead one, not a burned-out remnant, a dormant one. Its energy signature so faint that 3 years of standard survey sweeps had missed it entirely, camouflaged by the natural thermal noise of the surrounding graveyard. But Hayes's deep scan had gone further, looked harder, and found the heartbeat. Slow, ancient, patient. The alien power core was still running. Hayes did not immediately report this to Webb. He ran the analysis 4 more times first, because he was a careful man, and because the implications of what he was looking at were so enormous that he needed to be absolutely certain before he said the words out loud. On the 5th run, the reading was identical to the first 4. He called Webb. Webb called Harmon. Harmon suited up and went to Sector 14 personally. He floated in front of the power core, which, up close, was the size of a small city block, its surface covered in geometric engravings that had probably meant something significant to the civilization that built it, and stared at the deep scan readout for a long time. "How much power is it storing?" he asked. Hayes pulled up the numbers. Current charge level, accounting for degradation over what we estimate as several centuries of dormancy. "Sir, it's at approximately 31% capacity." "And at 31%, what does it output?" Not because he didn't know the answer. Because he was still having trouble saying it without feeling slightly ridiculous. "At 31%, he said carefully, "it outputs more energy than our entire planetary grid. Every power source on every human installation in the Sol system combined, running simultaneously for approximately 400 years. Harmon stared at the power core. The power core hummed quietly back at him, ancient, indifferent, astonishing. "Wire it into the Indomitable," Harmon said. Webb, floating beside him, opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sir, we don't know what happens when you activate an alien power source of this magnitude inside a ship built from alien megastructure panels that were designed to harvest a different stars." "Wire it in," Harmon said. "We'll find out." It was either the most reckless decision he had ever made, or the most necessary one. Standing in the cold silence of the graveyard, with the alien fleet's blockade visible as a distant constellation of unnatural lights at the edge of the system, Harmon was no longer certain there was a difference. The Indomitable was completed on a Thursday morning, 11 months and 19 days after hull assembly began. She was 3 kilometers long and nearly 1 kilometer wide at her broadest point. With a hull that no human sensor array could fully characterize because the stellar composite absorbed most scanning frequencies and returned the rest in patterns that existing analysis software simply could not categorize. From a distance, she looked like a fragment of the graveyard itself, dark, angular, patchwork, except for the 8 primary thermal collector arrays mounted along her dorsal spine, each one capable of being charged to full discharge capacity in approximately 4 minutes, and the alien power core buried at her center, humming with the patient energy of a civilization that no longer existed. She was the most dangerous object humanity had ever built. Harmon stood in her command center, a human-constructed space carved into the forward section of the alien hull, its walls a jarring contrast of human standard alloy panels and the darker, denser alien composite that surrounded them on all sides, and looked at his bridge crew. 15 people, all of them hand-selected, all of them the kind of person who had stopped fearing death sometime in the last decade, and replaced that fear with something harder and more useful. "Status," Harmon said. Lieutenant James Kovacs, his tactical officer, read from his console. "Power core at 31.4% and stable. Thermal arrays charged to 70% across the board. Hull integrity confirmed at 100% across all sections. Navigation systems calibrated and locked. He paused. She's ready, sir. Harmon looked at the forward viewport. The alien blockade was visible from here. Not as individual ships exactly, but as a presence. A thickening of space at the system's edge. A weight. Humanity had been living under that weight for over a century. It had become so familiar that most people had stopped consciously registering it. The way a man living under constant noise eventually stops hearing it. Harmon heard it. He had always heard it. Open a channel to Hephaestus, he said. Webb's voice came through a moment later, tinny with distance, but steady. We're watching, Commander. Tell the crew they built something that will matter, Harmon said. Make sure they hear that from me. They already know, Webb said. Good hunting. Harmon closed the channel. He turned to his navigation officer, a quiet, precise man named Ryan Cole, who had been flying salvage craft in the graveyard for 6 years and knew the debris field better than any other pilot alive. Plot us a course out of the field. Nice and slow. Let's not announce ourselves before we need to. Course plotted, Cole said. Transit time to clear the debris field. 40 minutes. Take us out. The Indomitable moved. That was perhaps the most quietly astonishing moment of the entire endeavor. Not the combat, not the weapons fire, not the confrontation that would come. The moment when a 3-kilometer vessel built from alien wreckage, powered by an ancient alien power core, crewed by 200 humans who had been living in secret for over a year, simply started moving. Gliding out of the debris field with the slow, inexorable gravity of something that had always been inevitable. She was 12 minutes clear of the graveyard when the alien fleet detected her. Harmon had expected this. No amount of stellar composite hull could hide a power signature of the magnitude the alien core was generating. The moment the Indomitable entered open space, she lit up on every sensor array pointed at the inner system. He had factored that into the plan. What he had not fully factored in was the alien response, not the tactical response. The thing he hadn't accounted for, couldn't have accounted for, because no human being had ever been in a position to observe it, was the quality of the alien response. It was hesitation. For 47 seconds, the alien blockade fleet did nothing. 47 seconds, by the calculations of human military analysts, who had spent decades studying alien response patterns, was an eternity. The aliens moved fast. They processed information fast. Their standard response time to any anomalous event in the Sol system had historically been measured in single-digit seconds. 47 seconds of stillness meant something had happened that they needed time to process. Kovacs was watching his tactical readout with an expression that mixed professional focus with something approaching awe. They're not moving, he said quietly. They recognize the hull material, Harmon said. He had been thinking about this. They're looking at a ship built from pieces of their own civilization, and they're trying to understand what they're seeing. Does that give us an advantage? It gives us a window. Harmon straightened in his command seat. Charge the forward arrays to full. Target their primary command cluster, the large formation at bearing 075. Kovacs worked his console. Charging, estimated full charge in 3 minutes 40 seconds. The 47 seconds of alien stillness ended. Their fleet began to move, not with the slow deliberateness of a blockade adjustment, but with the sharp, purposeful geometry of a combat formation. They had processed what they were looking at. They had reached a conclusion, and their conclusion was clearly that whatever this object was, it needed to be destroyed immediately. Hundreds of alien vessels reoriented simultaneously. Incoming, Kovacs said flatly. How long until they're in weapons range? At current approach vector, 4 minutes 20 seconds. Harmon did the math. 4 minutes 20 seconds until alien weapons came into range. 3 minutes 40 seconds until the Indomitable's forward arrays reached full charge. A 40-second window. Make us a hard target. Don't let them bracket us. The Indomitable moved, and the difference between a ship built from alien megastructure panels and a conventional human warship became immediately, viscerally apparent. She was enormous. 3 kilometers of mass. But the alien power core drove her with an efficiency that made her responsive in ways that should have been physically impossible for something her size. She slid through the evasion pattern like something alive, the stars wheeling around her, as Cole threw her through maneuvers that human-built ships would have torn themselves apart attempting. The first alien weapons fire reached them at minus 30 seconds. It hit the Indomitable's hull and did absolutely nothing. Not nothing in the sense of minor damage, nothing in the literal sense. The energy dispersed across the stellar composite hull like light across still water, absorbed, distributed, rendered harmless by a material that had been designed to withstand the output of an entire star. Hull status? Harmon asked. Kovacs checked his board. Checked it again. 0 damage, sir. 0. The bridge was silent for a beat. Then Ryan Cole said, very quietly, "They can't hurt us." "Not yet," Harmon said, "and in 30 seconds, we show them the same courtesy doesn't apply in reverse." He looked at Kovacs. "The ray status?" "Full charge in 8 seconds." Harmon watched the tactical display. The alien command cluster, the densest concentration of their fleet, the nerve center of a blockade that had strangled humanity for over a century, sat at bearing 075, massive and ancient and utterly certain of its own invulnerability. 5 seconds, Kovacs said. Harmon leaned forward slightly. 3. The Indomitable had been built from the bones of the alien civilization's own megastructures. She had been powered by their own dormant energy core. She had been armed with their own thermal collection arrays, reverse-engineered and turned into weapons of a scale that no human-built warship had ever carried. 1. And now, for the first time in 103 years, humanity was not reacting. The thermal arrays discharged. There was no sound in space. There was never sound in space. But inside the Indomitable, the discharge of 8 fully charged alien thermal collector arrays produced a vibration so deep and so total that it moved through the hull, through the decks, through the bones of every person aboard, less a sound than a feeling, the way the ground feels when something enormous falls nearby. Then, the light came. 8 coherent energy beams, each one the output of a thermal collector array originally designed to harvest solar energy at continent-scale efficiency, converged on the alien command cluster at bearing 075. The result was not an explosion in any conventional sense. The alien vessels in the cluster simply came apart, not violently, not in the dramatic fireball fashion of human naval combat, but cleanly, structurally, as if the bonds holding their matter together had been politely informed that their services were no longer required. The energy dispersal was so complete, so perfectly distributed through the target mass, that what had been the nerve center of the alien blockade fleet ceased to exist as organized matter in approximately 3 seconds. Where the command cluster had been, there was now a rapidly expanding cloud of particles, catching the distant light of the blockaded sun. Kovacs stared at his tactical readout. He had been a military officer for 14 years. He had seen weapons fire. He had run combat simulations until the scenarios ran together in his sleep. He had never seen anything like this. "Target," he said, and his voice was very level, the voice of a professional, "is gone." The alien fleet stopped moving. Not in the hesitant processing way they had paused when the Indomitable first emerged from the graveyard. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had just encountered a category of event it did not have a response protocol for. Their command cluster, the coordinating intelligence of the entire blockade, the communication and tactical hub around which the rest of the fleet organized itself, had been eliminated in 3 seconds by weapons built from their own technology. Whatever the aliens had been expecting from the inner system, it had not been this. "They're reconfiguring," Kovacs reported, studying the tactical display. "Multiple fleet segments repositioning. Looks like they're trying to reform a command structure on the fly." "How long?" Harmon asked. "Unknown. Their coordination is degraded. We're seeing fragmented movement patterns, individual ships acting without centralized direction." Harmon looked at the tactical display. The alien fleet was enormous. Even with the command cluster gone, there were thousands of vessels ranging from moon-sized structures to smaller combat units, and all of them were beginning to realize what had just happened to their center of gravity. "Array recharge time?" he asked. 6 minutes 40 seconds for a second full discharge, Kovacs said. "Target their largest remaining formation, the secondary cluster at bearing 110. Begin charging immediately." "Charging," Harmon stood. He moved to the forward viewport and looked at the battlefield. The alien fleet was vast. He had always known that intellectually. The sensor data, the strategic assessments, the century of documentation, all confirmed it. But standing here, seeing it directly through the viewport, was something different. These were not just numbers on a chart. This was the force that had caged humanity for over a century, the weight that had pressed every living person on Earth, Mars, and every surviving orbital habitat into a narrower and narrower survival corridor, until the simple act of being alive felt like a daily negotiation with extinction. And now that force was in disarray. Because of 8 thermal arrays, because of a power core found sleeping in a debris field, because a man named Marcus Webb had figured out what frequency made alien alloys sing. Harmon pressed one hand against the viewport, the same gesture he had made a year ago at Hephaestus, staring out at the graveyard, the morning before he told Webb to pull up the construction proposal. Then his tactical officer said, "Sir, I'm picking up something unusual in the alien fleet movement." Define unusual. Kovacs was working his console with rapid, precise movements. His expression shifting from professional calm to something more focused. The fragmented fleet segments, they're not trying to reform a centralized command structure. They're pulling back, across the board, all segments, all vectors. He looked up. They're retreating. The bridge went quiet. Not the quiet of tension or fear. The quiet of people absorbing information that they have been waiting for. At some level of the soul, for their entire lives. All segments? Harmon said. All segments, sir. Full withdrawal. They're clearing the inner system perimeter. Lieutenant Kovacs had been born during the blockade. He had never known a solar system without the alien presence at its edge. Neither had his parents. His grandparents had been children when the aliens arrived, and those grandparents were long dead. And the blockade had outlasted every human being who could remember what the Sol system felt like before. His hands were steady on his console, but his voice, when he spoke next, had something in it that no amount of professional composure could fully contain. "They're leaving," he said. Harmon stood at the viewport for a long moment, watching the alien fleet, that ancient, patient, civilization-scale force, begin its slow withdrawal from the system humanity had been born in. From the sun that had warmed the first humans who ever looked up at the sky and wondered what was out there. Then he turned to his communications officer. "Open a channel to every human installation in the Sol system," he said. "Earth, Mars, every habitat, every outpost, every shelter." "Channel open, sir." Harmon looked at the viewport one more time, then he looked at his crew. 15 people in a ship built from alien wreckage, powered by alien energy, armed with alien weapons, and entirely profoundly human in every way that mattered. "This is Commander Dale Harmon of the Indomitable." His voice was steady. "The blockade is broken. Sol system is free. Come home." Static. Then voices. Then, across every frequency, from every corner of the caged solar system, the sound of a species that had just remembered what hope felt like. But outside, at the edge of the retreating alien fleet, something was happening that Kovacs had not yet reported. Something his instruments were still trying to classify. Because 3 of the alien vessels had not retreated with the others. They had stopped. They were holding position at the system boundary. And they were broadcasting. Not weapons targeting signals, not tactical communications. Something else entirely. Something that Harmon's translation systems couldn't parse. Not because the signal was encrypted, but because no human being had ever received a signal in this particular format before. Whatever the aliens were saying, they were saying it directly to the Indomitable. The signal repeated 17 times before Harmon's translation systems produced anything usable. It came through in fragments at first, mathematical structures rather than language, geometric progressions that the AI parsing system kept trying to fit into known alien communication frameworks, before finally abandoning those frameworks entirely and building a new one from scratch. The process took 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the 3 alien vessels held their position at the system boundary with the absolute stillness of objects that had nowhere to be in a hurry. The patience of a civilization that measured time in geological epochs. The rest of the alien fleet had continued its withdrawal. The blockade was genuinely dissolving. Every human sensor array in the Sol system was now tracking the departure of forces that had been a fixed feature of human existence for over a century. And the signals flooding every communications channel from every surviving human installation were a chaos of shock, grief, relief, and a kind of stunned, disoriented joy that had no clean vocabulary because no living human had ever felt it before. Harmon sat in his command seat and waited for the translation. When it came, it was not what he expected. The alien message, as best the translation system could render it in human language, accounting for structural losses, for conceptual gaps, for the inherent impossibility of perfectly mapping one civilization's framework of meaning onto another's, was approximately this. You have used the remnants of a failed construction. We had abandoned this star system as non-viable following the structural collapse of our early installation. We did not consider the resident species relevant to our calculus. We acknowledge our error in assessment. The vessel you have constructed demonstrates a category of adaptive problem-solving that falls outside our standard classification for developing civilizations. We withdraw from contested space. We will not return to this system. And then, after a pause in the signal that the translation system flagged as possibly significant, we will remember you. Harmon read the translation 3 times. Then he forwarded it to Webb at Hephaestus with a single line of his own appended. They called us a developing civilization. Webb's response came back in 40 seconds. We'll fix that. The 3 alien vessels departed 11 minutes later. By the time Earth's dawn rotation was beginning its morning news cycle, with the news of the blockade's end, the Sol system was empty of alien presence for the first time in 103 years. The aftermath was not clean. Aftermath rarely is. The political situation that emerged in the weeks and months following the Indomitable's engagement was as complex as any military victory in human history. Arguably more so, because humanity had spent so long organizing itself around the premise of the siege that removing it exposed every fracture and tension that the siege had been pressing down. There were disputes about resources, about territory, about who had the right to make decisions for the species now that the external threat had been neutralized. Central Command, which had been kept in the dark about the Indomitable project throughout its construction, had a range of reactions to the discovery that a station commander had conducted an unauthorized weapons development program, built the most powerful warship in human history, and broken the alien blockade without filing the correct forms. And those reactions ranged from furious to quietly, deeply grateful, sometimes in the same person. Harmon appeared before a military tribunal 6 weeks after the Battle of Sol. The charges were significant on paper. Unauthorized resource allocation, falsified operational reports, conducting military action without Central Command authorization. The tribunal lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, every charge was dropped, and Harmon was promoted to admiral, a rank that had been largely ceremonial for most of a century, by a unanimous vote of the Central Command Council. Nobody mentioned the falsified reports again. Webb was awarded the first civilian engineering distinction the Council had issued in 40 years. He was also, quietly, given unlimited research access to the remaining alien megastructure materials in the graveyard, which, now that the blockade was gone and salvage operations could expand, turned out to be approximately 400 times larger than anyone had previously estimated. He went back to work the same week. Connor Hayes was given command of a new research division whose mandate was to continue studying the alien power core still installed in the Indomitable. The core, which had been running at 31% capacity, had discharged to approximately 28% during the battle. Based on Hayes's projections, it would return to its original charge level in somewhere between 6 months and 2 years through passive solar absorption. A fact that, given the energy figures involved, meant the Indomitable's theoretical weapons capacity would continue increasing indefinitely. Hayes found this both exciting and slightly alarming, which Webb told him was the correct response to any discovery of that magnitude. The Indomitable herself was not decommissioned. There was no serious discussion of decommissioning her. She remained active, crewed, and armed, stationed at the edge of the Sol system's outer boundary, not as an aggressive posture, but as a simple and clear communication to anyone watching. Humanity was no longer an undefended species. The alien message, "We will remember you," was never officially interpreted. Academic institutions spent years analyzing it. Was it a threat, a warning, something that functioned in the alien framework more like acknowledgement? The translation system's rendering of it had been flagged as highly uncertain. The AI noting that the geometric structures underlying the phrase might map to human language concepts, ranging from respectful recognition to something closer to what humans might call fear. Harmon thought it was probably both. He thought about that message often in the years that followed. Standing at the viewport of the Indomitable's command center, which had become something of a habit, inherited from those early dawn walks along the spine during construction, watching the outer system, watching the stars. The galaxy was vast. He had known that intellectually for his entire life. But the siege had made it feel small and suffocating, the Sol system compressed into a cell. Humanity's horizon reduced to the edge of the blockade. Now the horizon was gone, and the vastness was real again, not as a threat, but as a fact. A fact full of implications that would take decades, probably centuries, to fully understand. The aliens who had built the graveyard were still out there somewhere, moving between stars, wrapping suns in engineered shells, doing the slow geological work of a civilization that had been operating on a scale humanity was only beginning to grasp. But they had withdrawn, and they had left a message. And somewhere in the alien calculus of power and assessment, humanity had moved from the category of non-relevant resident species to something else. Something worth remembering. Harmon thought that was enough. For now. For now the sun was free, the Sol system was open, and somewhere in the asteroid belt, in a debris field that humanity had been slowly picking through for decades without ever asking the right question, Marcus Webb and his team were already drawing blueprints for the next thing they were going to build. 'Cause that was what humans did. They looked at the wreckage left behind by forces that thought them irrelevant, and they built something the universe had never seen before. And they were only getting started. If this story hit different, share it with someone who needs to hear that human grit beats ancient power every single time. Drop a comment below. What would you have built from that alien graveyard? And if you're new here, subscribe to HFY Endurance Tales. We tell the stories where humanity refuses to lose every single time.